Every night, a chef feeds homeless veterans. Unaware, one would introduce him to Gordon Ramsay. The ritual had become as natural to Marco Delgado as breathing, loading his van with still steaming containers of food after closing his struggling restaurant, driving to the forgotten corners of the city where those who had once served now struggled to survive. The small bistro, Hearth and Soul, barely kept its doors open most days. Located on a side street that saw little foot traffic, it survived on the loyalty of a handful of regulars and Marco's stubborn refusal to admit defeat. The space felt emptier tonight, the last customer having departed an hour earlier than usual. Marco's shoulders slumped slightly as he counted the evening's meager earnings. His sous chef, Alicia, watched him from the kitchen doorway, her dark eyes soft with concern. Another slow night? Marco shrugged, pushing back a strand of salt and pepper hair that had escaped his bandana. We covered costs. That's something. You know, most restaurant owners wouldn't cook extra meals every night for people who can't pay, Alicia said, nodding toward the containers Marco was carefully stacking in insulated bags. Most restaurant owners didn't have a father who came back from Vietnam and couldn't find his way home. Marco replied, his voice carrying the weight of old memories. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, labeling each container: beef stew, roasted vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven. Outside, the November air bit at Marco's cheeks as he loaded the van. The weather forecast had mentioned dropping temperatures, possibly snow by morning. He added extra blankets to his usual supplies, a habit formed over the 3 years he'd been making these nightly deliveries. 20 minutes later, Marco parked beneath a highway overpass. The small encampment of tents and makeshift shelters had grown since last winter. He recognized most of the faces that emerged from the shadows at the sound of his van. Men and women who had traded uniforms for street clothes, military precision for survival instincts. Chefs here. The call went out, and Marco felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness as they approached. Some walked with limps or missing limbs. Others carried the invisible wounds of war in their eyes. All of them had served a country that had somehow forgotten them when they returned. Marco set up his makeshift serving station on the folding table he kept in the van. Steam rose from the containers as he opened them, releasing aromas that transformed the bleak setting for a brief moment. "What's cooking tonight, chef?" asked Ray, a former army medic with a perpetual smile despite the circumstances that had brought him here. "Beef bourguignon?" Marco answered, ladling the rich stew into a bowl. "My grandmother's recipe, though she'd probably cursed me in Italian for the shortcuts I took." Ray laughed, accepting the bowl with hands that bore the fine tremor of someone fighting multiple battles. "No complaints from this crowd, chef. Best restaurant in town." Marco continued serving, exchanging greetings and brief conversations with each person. He knew most of their names, bits of their stories, the small preferences that made them individuals rather than statistics, like how Sergeant Williams couldn't eat cilantro, or how Ms. Cooper, a former helicopter pilot, always saved half her meal for later. As the line thinned, Marco noticed a figure hanging back in the shadows. Someone new. In this community, newcomers often approach cautiously, pride warring with hunger. "There's plenty," Marco called out gently to the silhouette. "No need to wait." The man who stepped forward was tall and gaunt, with a military bearing that years on the street hadn't erased. His beard was neatly trimmed despite his worn clothes, and his eyes, a startling blue, held a clarity that caught Marco off guard. "Don't mean to impose," the man said, his voice carrying a soft southern accent. "Name's Daniel. Daniel Forrester." Marco extended his hand. "Marco Delgado. And you're not imposing. This is why I'm here." Daniel's handshake was firm, his palm calloused. "Army 10th Mountain Division. 2 tours in Afghanistan. My father was Vietnam. Marines." Marco served him a generous portion. "How long have you been in the area?" 3 days. Daniel replied, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. "Been moving north, trying to outrun some memories. Not working so well." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. There was something about Daniel that struck Marco. A dignity that transcended circumstances, perhaps, or the way he thanked Marco with the sincerity of someone who understood the value of small kindnesses. After everyone had been served, Marco noticed Daniel helping an elderly veteran adjust his blanket before sitting down to eat his own meal. It was a small gesture, but revealed character in a way words couldn't. When Marco began packing up, Daniel approached with his empty bowl. "That was the first real meal I've had in months," he said quietly. "Reminded me of when I used to cook before." "You cook?" Marco asked, interest piqued. A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "Culinary school after my first tour. Worked in a few decent restaurants in Atlanta. Then my second deployment happened. Came back different. He tapped his temple. Couldn't handle the pressure of a professional kitchen anymore. Too many similarities to other things. Marco nodded, understanding more than Daniel might realize. His father had never been able to hold a job after returning from Vietnam. The sounds, the stress, the flashbacks making ordinary work impossible. If you're going to be around for a while, Marco said, making a decision in that moment, I could use an extra pair of hands at my place. Nothing high pressure. Prep work mostly. Paid under the table until we get you sorted with proper documentation. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, surprise and suspicion warring in his expression. You don't know me. I know enough, Marco replied, and I trust my instincts about people. They're rarely wrong. Daniel looked down at his empty bowl, then back at Marco. I can't make any promises about how long I'll stay in one place. No promises needed. Just show up tomorrow at noon if you're interested. Marco handed him a card with the restaurant's address. Back door. Ask for me. That night, driving back to his small apartment above the restaurant, Marco wondered if he'd see Daniel again. Something told him he would. The next morning brought snow as predicted. Fat flakes swirling against the restaurant windows. Marco opened alone as he did most days, the quiet routine of lighting pilots and brewing coffee as familiar as an old song. By 11, the lunch crowd, such as it was, had begun to trickle in. Mostly regulars who came as much for Marco's company as for his food. At precisely noon, a knock sounded at the back door. Daniel stood there, snowflakes melting in his beard, a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. You came, Marco said, unable to keep the pleased surprise from his voice. Daniel shifted his weight. I keep my word, chef, and I could use the work. Marco stepped aside to let him in. First things first, let's get you a proper meal, then we'll talk details. Over the next few weeks, Daniel proved himself invaluable. His knife skills were impeccable, his work ethic unquestionable. He moved with the focused precision of someone who found peace in routine. Marco noticed how Daniel positioned himself in corners of the kitchen, where he could see all entrances. How loud noises sometimes made him flinch before he mastered himself. But there were also moments of unexpected joy, like when Daniel suggested a modification to Marco's risotto that elevated it to something transcendent, or the night he made biscuits from memory that reminded Marco of the South in ways he couldn't articulate. Marco cleared out the small storage room upstairs, adding a cot and space heater. Daniel accepted the accommodation with quiet gratitude, though Marco often found him in the kitchen in the early morning hours, unable to sleep but finding solace in preparation and creation. The restaurant began to change subtly with Daniel's presence. Regulars noticed the enhanced flavors, the more artistic plating. Word spread, and new customers began to appear. Not a flood, but enough that Marco could breathe a little easier when he reviewed the books. One evening after closing, Marco found Daniel staring at the wall where Marco kept photos of the veterans he'd served over the years. You do this for them because of your father? Daniel asked without turning. Marco joined him at the wall. Partly. He struggled after coming home. No support, no understanding of what we now call PTSD. Self-medicated with alcohol until his liver gave out when I was 15. He touched a faded photograph of a young Marine with his arm around a smiling woman. But it's also because of what he taught me before things got bad. We're all just one meal away from remembering who we are, he used to say. Daniel nodded slowly. Your father was a wise man. Sometimes, Marco agreed, when the demons weren't too loud. He turned to Daniel. What about you? Any family? Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Had a wife. She waited through my first tour, tried to help after I came back from the second. Eventually realized she was trying to save someone who no longer existed. His voice held no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance. Can't blame her. I wasn't the man she married anymore. Marco understood the courage it took to share even that much. And cooking? How did that start? A soft smile transformed Daniel's face. My grandmother. She could make a feast from nothing. After my first tour, when everything felt disconnected, cooking was the only thing that made sense. Following steps, creating something nourishing. He shrugged. It grounded me. For a while, anyway. Their conversations often happen like this. In the quiet hours after service, small revelations offered like rare gifts between two men, more comfortable with action than words. As winter deepened, so did their friendship. Marco continued his nightly deliveries to the encampment. But now Daniel came along, adding his own touches to the meals they prepared. The veterans responded to him differently than they did to Marco. A brotherhood of shared experiences that Marco could respect but never fully understand. Christmas approached, bringing with it both increased business and a heavier melancholy among those they served. Marco decided to host a special dinner at the restaurant on Christmas Eve for the veterans, closing to regular customers for the evening. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked as they planned the menu. "Could be a decent night for paying customers." Marco waved away the concern. "Some things matter more than money." The night of the dinner, 23 veterans filled the small restaurant. Marco had put out a call to a few regular customers who donated decorations, small gifts, and extra food. The space glowed with candlelight and conversation. The usual barriers between server and served dissolved for one evening. Daniel moved through the room with a grace Marco hadn't seen before, at ease among his fellow veterans in a way he rarely was with civilians. Watching him share stories and laughter, Marco realized how much Daniel had healed in the short time they'd known each other, and how much his own life had been enriched by Daniel's presence. After the guests had departed, Marco and Daniel sat at the bar with glasses of whiskey, surrounded by the pleasant aftermath of the evening, dirty dishes and good memories. "Thank you," Daniel said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "For what?" "For this." Daniel gestured around the restaurant. "For giving me a chance when you had no reason to. For reminding me that I still know how to be part of something." Marco felt his throat tighten. "You've more than earned your place here. The restaurant's doing better than it has in years because of you." Daniel turned his glass slowly between his fingers. "I've been thinking I might be ready to try again. Not just prep work, but really cooking. Creating." He looked up, uncertainty in his eyes. "If you'd be willing to give me that opportunity." "I'd be honored," Marco said without hesitation. "To be honest, your risotto last week was better than anything I've made in a decade." They both laughed. The sound filling the empty restaurant was something that felt remarkably like hope. As winter yielded to spring, Hearth and Soul underwent a transformation. Daniel gradually took on more responsibilities in the kitchen, allowing Marco to focus on the front of house and their expanding community outreach. They formalized their veterans program, offering not just meals but occasional cooking classes and, for those interested and able, apprenticeship opportunities. Local press took notice. A small article in the neighborhood paper led to a feature in the city magazine about their work with veterans. Business improved steadily, reservations becoming necessary on weekends. Marco hired 2 more staff, both veterans recommended by friends of Daniel's. One rainy Tuesday in April, Marco was going over invoices when the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see a woman in a crisp blazer, tablet in hand, surveying the restaurant with professional interest. "Welcome to Hearth and Soul," Marco greeted her. "Table for one?" "Actually, I'm here on business," she replied with a polished smile. "My name is Alexandra Winters. I'm a producer with the Ramsay Restaurant Rescue Team." Marco blinked, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, the what?" "Gordon Ramsay's new show," she explained, watching his reaction closely. "We search for unique restaurants with compelling stories and exceptional potential." Marco's confusion must have been evident. "But we didn't apply for anything," Alexandra smiled. "No, you were nominated. Quite passionately, in fact." She glanced toward the kitchen. "Is Daniel Forrester available?" At that moment, Daniel emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He froze when he saw Alexandra. "You actually came," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Marco looked between them. "You know each other?" Alexandra extended her hand to Daniel. "We haven't met in person, but Mr. Forrester has been quite persistent in his communications." Daniel met Marco's confused gaze. "I wrote to them about what you've built here, about the veterans program, about how you've been pouring everything into this place for years with barely enough to keep the lights on." His voice grew more confident as he continued. "I sent them videos, testimonials from the vets whose lives you've changed. I told them they wouldn't find a more deserving chef or a more important mission anywhere in this city." Marco felt momentarily unmoored. "You did this?" "When Nurnana Suraman. I started the night after the Christmas dinner," Daniel admitted. "Sent follow-ups every 2 weeks since then." Alexandra interjected smoothly. "Mr. Forrester's dedication was impressive, but it was your story that caught our attention. Gordon personally selected your restaurant from our shortlist." Marco sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "Gordon Ramsay wants to feature my restaurant? If you're interested," Alexandra confirmed, "the exposure alone could transform your business, not to mention the renovation budget and Gordon's culinary input." Marco looked up at Daniel, who stood with uncharacteristic nervousness. "You did this for me? For the restaurant? You saved my life," Daniel said simply. "This was the only way I could think to possibly repay that." The filming began 3 weeks later. The restaurant closed for 10 days for the makeover and production. Gordon Ramsay arrived with his trademark intensity, but also a genuine respect for what Marco and Daniel had built together. He was particularly moved by their work with veterans, sharing off camera that his own father had struggled after military service. The episode captured the essence of what made Hearth and Soul special, not just the food or the atmosphere, but the healing that happened within its walls. Gordon worked with Daniel and Marco to elevate their menu while maintaining its soul, bringing in modern techniques while honoring the traditions that formed their foundation. The reveal of the renovated space left Marco speechless. Larger kitchen, updated dining area, and a dedicated space for their veterans programs. But the most meaningful moment came when Gordon unveiled the new Wall of Honor, an artistic installation featuring photographs and stories of the veterans they'd served, with Marco's father's picture at the center. When the episode aired months later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Reservations filled for months in advance. Donations poured in for their Veterans Initiative. Other restaurants across the country reached out, wanting to implement similar programs. 1 year after Daniel had first appeared in the shadows of the encampment, he and Marco stood together in the bustling kitchen of their now thriving restaurant. They had hired 8 more veterans, established a foundation to help others find culinary training, and were discussing opening a second location focused specifically on training and employing former military personnel. "Did you ever imagine this?" Marco asked as they watched their team work with practiced coordination during the dinner rush. Daniel shook his head, the confidence in his bearing a stark contrast to the haunted man Marco had first met. "Not even close. I was just trying to survive one more day when I found your meal service. And I was just trying to honor my father's memory," Marco replied. Funny how the smallest decisions can change everything. Through the kitchen doors, they could see the dining room filled with laughter and conversation, the wall of veterans' photos illuminated by soft lighting. Among the diners were some familiar faces, former recipients of their meals who now had homes, jobs, and were returning as paying customers. "Your father was right," Daniel said quietly. "We are all just one meal away from remembering who we are." Marco smiled, feeling the truth of those words more deeply than ever before. In feeding others, he had found his own purpose. In offering Daniel a chance, he had gained a friend and partner who had transformed his small act of kindness into something that would change countless lives. Outside, snow began to fall again, coming full circle to the day Daniel had first knocked on the restaurant's back door. But inside Hearth and Soul, warmth and hope flourished, proof that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with something as simple as a meal shared with a stranger.